All right, some housekeeping stuff. I'm sorry to do this to you all after getting started into the song, but starting next week, Carol and I are going to do some traveling of our own. So after this morning, for the next 3 Sundays, Zach has graciously offered or agreed to fill in for me. So for the next 3 Sundays, you will have Zach as your teacher. The plan, this morning's lesson is our 4th lesson on the song, and as you can see, we haven't gotten to verse 1 yet. This is all introduction stuff, and I want to finish it this morning. And then after the 3 weeks off, then we'll come back the end of August, and we'll dive into the actual song. And I'm still trying to figure out how I want to do that, because there's a lot of, obviously, stuff that can get embarrassing. So at any rate, so that's that. Secondly, you'll notice I've got my email address up on the slide. Last week, had somebody ask me, hey, do you have like a handout that you can share, your personal notes? And I do have my personal notes. I don't have them in a handout form this morning, but it occurs to me that because of the nature of this setting, I've got a whole bunch of stuff in my notes that I'm not sharing out loud. And so I've got my email address up there. If you are interested in seeing my notes and getting more in depth, I've got a whole bunch of quotes that aren't on the slides, because I just have to stop sometime. If I give you everything, we'd be here until 2026. So if you would like a copy of my notes, send me an email. I'm not going to just send them out to everybody, because my emails are more explicit than what I'm saying up here. Not my emails, my notes, because they're my notes for myself. So I'm just giving you that fair warning. You might see things, think, Virgil talked like that in his notes, but they're my own personal notes. If you would like them, and I'll edit them before I send them out to some extent at least, and just shoot me an email. I'm not going to send it to anybody who doesn't want it, but if you want it, I'm going to make you ask for it. So shoot me an email and I'll send it to you. All right, so as I said, we've been, the first 3, now 4 weeks is introductory material. And just by way of review, the first Sunday we looked at the song from the standpoint of what I believe is the essence of the song. And that's summed up in chapter 7, verse 10. I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. This song is a celebration of love, not only between a man and a woman, but between God and his people. God and his people. And God's love for his people has been described by Brennan Manning in a book entitled The Furious Longing of God. Yes, the book is awesome. The Furious Longing of God. And that is in part what this song is about. But as Connie reminded us on that very first Sunday, this book is about human beings loving each other too, and having a very strong desire for each other. And that's where things get kind of hinky. And so that was the first Sunday. The second Sunday, we looked at some of what I'm calling the challenges of the song. This is a very, very difficult song, not only for translators, but for scholars. We looked at the question of author. Who wrote this? Nobody really knows. And when did they write it? Nobody really knows. And we looked at some of the Hebrew issues. I know so little about Hebrew that at least the one thing I do know is that it's next to impossible to translate. And people wrestle with it. And if you have a study Bible and you're reading through the Song of Songs, you're going to see many, many footnotes saying things like, the Hebrew here is uncertain. The Hebrew here is uncertain. And there's a lot of uncertainty in it. And then last week, what I wanted to do is look at the historical context of the song as a piece of writing, as a literature. And so last week we realized this is a Jewish book. It's not a Christian book. So last week we looked at the Jewish view of marriage and sexuality to see the historical, cultural context in which the book was written. This week we're going to look at the Christian concept of marriage and sexuality to see the context in which the book was received and interpreted down through the centuries. And so with that, let's go back to my timeline. This is the same one I had last week, a couple little edits. On the top, we have the Jewish view of the timeline, and then on the bottom is the Christian. Last week, we looked at some of the Old Testament and some of the rabbinical writings, and some of it I enjoyed. It was just downright funny, especially the rabbis. The conclusion that I drew from last week is that both the Old Testament and the rabbis take a very positive view of both marriage and human intimacy. Okay? And we see in the Old Testament, we see stories like Ruth and Esther, where people are deliberately using their sexual attractiveness to find a mate. And those stories are provided in the Old Testament without any moral editorial comment. Nobody in the book of Ruth says that what Ruth did was horrible and wrong. I'm not suggesting anything from that other than to say that the stories are presented to us in a neutral fashion without any moral comment. But as I suggested last week, I've got 3 daughters, and now they're all 3 married, but there's no way I would have recommended that any of them use Ruth's method to find a husband, or Esther's method. And yet, it's presented in the Old Testament. The rabbinical Jews who were around at the same time as the people we're going to be talking about this morning, or at least the writings were around at the same time, they had a very positive view of marriage, sexuality. In Judaism, everybody is expected to be married, and basically as young as possible. You reach puberty, you get married. And one of the quite frank reasons for that is to help young people keep their sexuality in a marital context. And so you were expected to be married by the time you were 20 in Judaism. And so we have all that going on. This morning, we're going to look at the bottom timeline and the people along its plane. And we've got Plato that we'll look at, 400 BC, thereabouts. And I've got him there. Plato's obviously not a Christian. But I can get angry about the way Christianity has allowed itself to be influenced by so many things other than Jesus. And we have allowed ourselves to be influenced heavily by Plato in a lot of different contexts, and especially in this context that we're going to see this morning. So we got to look at Plato. I mean, when I was in college, I took Western cultural traditions. The course started with Plato because he's the father of the West. And so much of what we believe, think, feel, and say and do is influenced by Plato. And I hate admitting that in my own life, and I just don't like it. Then Jesus comes along in the first century. He shares his view of the world. And then we get Paul. We'll talk about Paul this morning. And then we'll talk about some of the early church fathers and how they viewed marriage and intimacy and how it was so very, very, very different from the way the Jews viewed it. And then that, in turn, influenced the way they read and interpret the Song of Songs. So that's how it all gets related. So with that, let's look at our friend Plato. Plato changes everything in terms of the way people think. And the one thing that was very, very important to Plato is what I'm calling a body-soul dualism. If we look at the Old Testament, especially the older Old Testament, we have the Hebrew word nephesh. And nephesh, if you look in your Bible, nephesh is almost always translated as soul. And that is right there an indication of Plato's influence on Christian Bible translators. The nephesh refers to the whole person, body, soul, mind, emotions. Whatever constitutes a person is a nephesh. And so that's what the word refers to. In Judaism, when people died, their whole nephesh went into Sheol. Sheol was just down below the ground. So when you got buried, your whole nephesh, body, whatever you were, went into Sheol. And so the Hebrews, especially the old Hebrews, did not have a clearly defined concept of a separate soul and body. That comes in with Plato. And with Plato, not only is it separate, but there is a qualitative distinction between the two. The soul is good. The body is bad. Material world for Plato is bad. So in Judaism, when you died, their solution to death is resurrection. The body that dies rises again. With Plato, the solution to death is your soul is finally freed from this horrible body. Okay, and when the soul is freed from the body rots in the ground, the soul goes off into a disembodied state, and everybody's happy. Well, because of Plato's low view of the body, he also had a low view of human sexuality. For Plato, the mind, the reason, that was where it was. That was where it was at. The mind, the reason, rationality was where it was. But for Plato, physical intimacy was considered what he called an irrational frenzy. Okay? It was just an irrational frenzy. He took a very, very low view of it, and he got to the point that where he said that its only justified purpose was to make babies. And if you weren't going to make babies, don't engage in intimacy. All of this thinking resulted in what the Oxford Study Bible refers to as Hellenistic asceticism. So with Plato, you get this asceticism, a voluntary deprivation of pleasure, voluntary deprivation of anything that's enjoyable, voluntary deprivation of food, clothing. It's that type of world, the world of the monastics. This began, at least philosophically, with Plato. Now, Plato, 400 BC, we already saw the rabbis who were around at about the time of Christ. They didn't buy into this, most of them. They didn't buy into his asceticism. They didn't buy into his body-soul dualism. They did not buy into mind, soul, good, body, bad. And so they kept teaching as they taught, which is what we looked at last week. But there were some Jews that did buy into it. And they were, if you look through the books, they are referred to as the Hellenized Jews. The Hellenized Jews. Probably the most prominent was a man by the name of Philo, lived around the time of Christ, from I think 20 BC to 50 AD. So overlapping with Jesus. Philo was a Jewish historian and philosopher. Like Plato, he condemned any physical intimacy that was engaged in for any purpose other than procreation. But Philo was in the minority amongst the Jews. Amongst the Jews, most of them followed the rabbis, and they would just pick their favorite rabbi, Shammai, Hillel, Akiva, whomever, and they would follow that rabbi. Well, then Jesus comes along, and he really doesn't have a whole lot to say directly about human sexuality. He does talk about marriage. But then we get to Paul. And with Paul, we get into 1 Corinthians 7. And here we have a verse that I am deliberately ripping out of context. And the reason I'm doing it is because I believe the early church fathers deliberately ripped it out of context, mistranslated it, or not mistranslated, but misunderstood it, and completely twisted Paul's teaching. Those of you who may not be as familiar with 1 Corinthians 7 as I am, I shared before that as a young single man, I lived in 1 Corinthians 7, trying to figure out, am I supposed to get married? Am I not supposed to get married? What's going on? 1 Corinthians 7 is a chapter that Paul wrote in response to Corinthian young men who asked the question, should we even bother getting married? And the reason they asked wasn't because they were thinking marriage isn't a very good thing, although Corinthian was a very, very sophisticated city in terms of Greek philosophy. So they would have understood and known about Plato's ideas of marriage and sexuality. They would have been aware of that. But what their biggest concern was, people in first century Corinth and throughout the Christian world thought that Jesus was coming like next week. Yes. And Paul even mentions that in 1 Corinthians 7. So they asked him, if Jesus is coming in a week or two, should I get married and start making babies? I mean, it'll all be for naught. And this is a common dilemma that people have when we try to put a date on when Jesus is returning, and you get all kinds of weird things happening where people sell everything, go off to a cult, and sit around and wait for Jesus, and then October 7th comes and Jesus doesn't come, and now what do I do? And this is what they were doing in Corinth. So Paul writes this chapter, and he starts out talking about, it's good for you not to touch a woman. But in order to avoid sexual sin, it's also good for every man to have a wife and every wife to have a husband. Okay? And then he says something that was really kind of revolutionary for the first century in Rome. He talks about husbands and wives not depriving each other, because your bodies don't belong to yourself, they belong to the other. Now, in first century Rome, that would have been true for a wife belonging to the husband, but not the husband belonging to the wife. And so what Paul wrote here was kind of revolutionary for that time and that culture. And like the Jewish rabbis of the day, Paul was raising up the recognition of the importance of satisfying the wife's needs. Okay? In Roman culture, nobody cared about satisfying a woman's needs. That just wasn't the concern. Paul makes it a priority for the husband to make sure he satisfies his wife's needs, the wife to make sure that she's satisfying her husband's needs. It went both ways. This egalitarianism with Paul, with man and woman, was a totally new thing in the Roman culture where they lived. But then, Paul very clearly states, on some of these other issues, I have my own opinion, but not a command from God. And he says, my opinion is this: because we do believe that Jesus is coming in a couple weeks, it's probably good for you to think about maybe not getting married. Okay? Paul believed that Jesus was coming very soon. And so he comes out with this verse that's been so ripped out of context. So then, the one who marries his own virgin does well, but the one who does not does better. And that word better gets picked up by the early church fathers, and they add some steroids to it, and they add some personal shame and guilt from their own lives to it, and they completely mess up everything. And I was just sharing with Ron before the class, the more I prepared this lesson, the angrier I got at the early church fathers for just totally messing things up. And I'm probably sharing more of my own personal opinions here than I want to, but let me at least get into them. What happened was the early church fathers ran with Paul's teaching, and they developed an attitude that basically being single, remaining celibate, is a more virtual, more spiritually advanced state than getting married and having babies. For them, getting married and having babies was a concession to biological reality, but the real spiritual people remain single. Okay? And we're going to be looking at Saints Jerome and Augustine. I'm going to highlight those two this morning, but they weren't alone. You see it in the writings of Tertullian. You see it with Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom. They all looked at this in the same way. And many of them, most of them, went back to the garden and tried to explain the fall in terms of some sort of sexual sin. Irenaeus, both Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus said that the fall, or that sexual intimacy between Adam and Eve, constituted man's first disobedience. Yeah, some of you are giving me a look like, huh? And that was my reaction too. Irenaeus, his view was kind of unique, because if you'll recall from our study many years ago, Irenaeus believed that Adam and Eve were created as infants. He believed that they had to experience everything that every human being experiences. So they were created as infants. Don't tell me how they got fed or who changed their diapers, but they were created as infants, okay? And so what he said, basically, is that they made love too young. They were underage. And that was what constituted the first sin. They got together before they were supposed to. Okay? This kind of thinking is all over the early Christians. And one of the reasons for this is because these early Christian guys, their own personal lives were messed up. Most of them were single themselves, in part because they believed that was the better way to go. And so when you're single and you're trying to teach people about marriage, you're going to try to exalt your own status. Now that's what they were doing. But let's dive into St. Jerome. St. Jerome, and I am deliberately using their titles of saint, just in my own mind to show the irony of some of this. But St. Jerome, first of all, I'm picking Jerome and Augustine because they are the two giants of Western Christianity, absolute giants. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, into the Latin Vulgate in the Roman Catholic Church. To this day, the Latin Vulgate that Jerome translated in 400 AD is the Bible. It is the official Bible. They rely upon the Latin Vulgate over and above Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. Okay, so Jerome is the guy for Western Catholicism. By way of background, Jerome had he was born in a wealthy family, got well educated. When he was a young man, I'm not sure exactly how old, I think late teens, his parents sent him to Rome for further education. While there, he engaged in some casual hookups and felt horribly guilty as a result. He visited the catacombs of Rome, where historical stuff happened, and he felt like he was in the pits of hell. And his conscience weighed on him, and everything stirred. And as a result of all of his background and then his studies of the scriptures, he took the view that marriage and sex were a result of the fall. That God never intended Adam and Eve to come together sexually. And so we have this quote from him. Some of my quotes are going to be somewhat paraphrased, simply to get everything on the screen, and I've kind of edited some of the words to be a little bit less graphic. And as regards Adam and Eve, we must maintain that before the fall, they were virgins in paradise. But after they sinned and were cast out of paradise, they were immediately married. He would point out that, the first actual time we see any reference to Adam and Eve coming together, Genesis 4:1, and that's after the fall. So he was convinced that virginity amongst people is the only noble state. That celibacy is the only state of proper spirituality. Marriage, sexuality is just a concession. He said that marriage replenishes the earth, but virginity fills paradise. And so he lived an amazingly ascetic lifestyle, extreme asceticism. And it's kind of interesting. He had a relationship with a wealthy woman by the name of Paula. And Paula basically financed a lot of Jerome's work. There were accusations that Jerome and Paula were having an intimate relationship. He flatly denied it, and quite frankly, based on the way he believed, I fully believe his denials. Paula had several children from a prior marriage, and this story gets really sad. And another story that sort of roused me up a little bit. But Jerome encouraged Paula and her daughters to live extremely ascetic lives. Even though they were wealthy, they wore rags. They didn't wear the clothes that they could afford. They wore rags. They fasted to the point of destroying their health. They never bathed. I mean, it was a really rough lifestyle that Jerome fully encouraged. And as I was reading this story of Jerome and Paula never bathing, wearing rags, fasting to excess, I thought in my mind the contrast between her and Ruth in the Old Testament, who bathed, who anointed herself with oils, put on her best clothes, and went out and found her husband. Jerome encouraged us with Paula, and he encouraged her daughters to do the same thing, and one of them was, I guess, a little bit more reluctant to come into the lifestyle. She finally did, and a couple weeks later, she died from fasting too much. And when Paula grieved, Jerome got angry at Paula and told her to buck up, and that her daughter was in a better place now, and that he would immortalize her in his writings. This is the guy who's telling us how to live our lives, at least the people of the 400s. Ron, was your hand sort of up? Okay. Jerome went on to say, or at least this is summarizing of his writings by another man, neither marriage nor sex existed in the Garden of Eden, and sexuality has no relationship to the image of God. Has no relationship. So in his mind, there's nothing about human intimacy that is a reflection of anything in God's image. Totally different viewpoint than the Jewish rabbis took. I'll have a slide later on, but Jerome, you say, okay, now, if this is the way Jerome felt, what would he do with the Song of Songs? It's amazing what he did with the Song of Songs. We'll see later. He basically interpreted and translated the Song of Songs to be a book praising celibacy and virginity. And I've got an example of that later on. Yes, Susan.
I'm assuming that Jerome and others maybe in a similar line of thought and with power and authority were the ones really pushing the whole, like, Mary never had children. I mean, I've always wondered about that part of the Catholic belief system, that she remained a virgin and that she never had children.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It seems like that would be super important to them, that Jesus only was raised by somebody who engaged in this lifestyle versus what we really had
Yeah.
to work hard to believe she didn't have children.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that I have found anything that specifically says that this all goes back to Jerome, but certainly the train of thought. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these guys, their writing is very, very clear. And in fact, as we'll see when we get to Augustine, let me get to Augustine. Augustine took a softer view than Jerome, and I was kind of surprised to see this. But when we get to Augustine, he talks about celibacy being the honorable state, and he makes the point that, okay, Augustine was the inventor of original sin. The idea that because Adam sinned, all y'all are deserving of never-ending punishment in hell, not because of anything that you have done individually, but simply because you are of the seed of Adam. Okay, I mean that's how strong Augustine's view was about original sin. We don't burn in hell because of the sin we committed. We burn in hell because of the sin Adam committed, and his guilt was passed on to Cain and Abel through the marital act with Eve. Cain and Abel passed it on to their children through the marital act. For Augustine, sexual intimacy was the act that transmitted original sin from person to person and guilt. Hang on, let me just finish the thought. And then by extension, this is why Jesus was sinless, because he was not born of the seed of Joseph. And so that was how that happens. And of course, logic would then dictate that Mary had to be just as immaculate as Jesus. So, I mean, you have this whole legend about basically the virgin birth of Mary. And it just goes on and on. Yeah, Ron.
Just to say, that's why the act of baptizing infants was so important, because that supposedly, the water baptism exonerated people, forgave them of Adam's sin.
Yes, and for those of you online who couldn't hear that, Ron was pointing out very rightly that this whole idea of original sin is where baptism of infants came up. And in the Roman Catholic Church, well, in 400 everybody was Catholic, but in that time, they believed that basically if you were born and you died before you had a chance to get baptized, that was it. You're in hell forever because of Adam's original sin. And so you would get baptized as soon as possible so that you would be absolved and forgiven of the original sin of Adam. Now, you still have to deal with your own sin, but that's where the sacrament of confession comes up. Yeah, Kelsey.
So then what would their interpretation of Genesis 2 be when God commands before the fall, fruitful, multiply?
Yeah.
Unless they interpret it as that being commanded after the fall, but then we also hear about God talking with them before them. So I'm
Yeah.
curious what their interpretation of that.
Yeah, and I saw the question raised in the writings. I never got a really clear answer. One of Augustine's earlier writings construed that spiritually, not physically, to be fruitful and multiply spiritually. not physically. Augustine, I mean, his life was just as bad as Jerome's. Jerome never married, by the way. So he had a life of sexual activity, never married. So the only emotion that he could ever associate with the physical act of love was fear, shame, and guilt. And that can be very powerful. And so Augustine, his life is very similar to Jerome's in that regard. As a young man, he was very sexually active. Got to a point where he settled down with a mistress. She was beneath him socially, so he couldn't marry her, so he never did. But they stayed together for, I believe, 10 to 15 years. And during that time, they were faithful to each other. And during that time, it was before Augustine became a Christian. After he became a Christian, his mother, who had been a Christian for a very long time, convinced Augustine to dump his mistress, which he did, and to get engaged to a proper girl who happened to be about 11 years old. By this time, Augustine's 30 or more. And the proper Christian girl was about 11. They got engaged. In Rome at the time, you had to be at least 12 or 13 before you could get married. So Augustine agreed to be engaged, wait for the girl to become of age, and then marry her. Problem was his sexual appetite was so strong he could not even stay pure for a couple of years, and he eventually broke off the engagement and never did get married. Again, like Jerome, all Augustine ever knew was sexual intimacy outside of marriage, and his life was full of fear, shame, and guilt. And he brought that into his theology. So, unlike Jerome, Augustine said that marriage and sexuality were part of the original creation. Okay, so in his mind, there was no problem with Adam and Eve coming together before the fall. What he said that was weird was that physical desire and pleasure were a result of the fall. Okay, so I was going to say picture this. I don't want you to picture this. Imagine this. Imagine this, according to Augustine, if Adam and Eve wanted to have children, they would have committed the same act as we all do when we want to have children. But the act would not have involved desire, arousal, pleasure, or anything else. Augustine could not come to grips with the fact that human conception requires, at least for the man, that he lose control of his body. He could not accept that. And so he took the view that prior to the fall, human conception would have been an act as much under the control as me picking up my clicker and clicking on the screen. No arousal, no pleasure. And so that was his view. So that after the fall, that's when desire and pleasure became known to Adam and Eve. That's when suddenly they realized that they were naked, they were shamed, and they had to cover up. So this is a paraphrase of one of Augustine's quotes. And here's the way he puts it, because he takes a little bit more honorable view of marriage as an institution, but he still highly values celibacy. He says this: intimacy in marriage for procreation has no fault, but for the satisfying of sexual passion, even within marriage, it has venial fault. A venial fault in Catholicism, venial sin, is a forgivable sin. It's not a mortal sin. You don't die. Venial sin is more minor, but it's still sin. So for Augustine, for a husband and wife to come together for marital relations for the pleasure of it, for him that was a sin. But it was a minor one. And then he says, of course, abstaining from all intimacy is better even than having the procreative intimacy of marriage. So these guys were saying, even if you get married, it is better within your marriage if you still abstain from coming together sexually. So marriage was put on a lower level, and even within marriage, sexual intimacy was discouraged. I was really nervous before coming to church this morning, and now I know why. This stuff is not easy to talk about. In most marriages, there will be an imbalance between the desire for intimacy between the husband and the wife. Okay? In almost all marriages, one spouse has a higher level of desire than the other. That's hormonal, it's to be expected. About 75% of marriages, it's the husband who has the higher drive. 25% of marriages, it's the wife that has the higher drive. And that will change throughout your marriage. If you're married more than a few years, you'll discover that changes. And so, what Augustine said, and he went into a lot of detail, but what he said was, when the low drive spouse engages in physical activity with the high drive spouse, then the low drive spouse they are acting out of a higher level of Christian love, because they are acting out of a selfless giving to the high drive spouse, whereas the high drive spouse is acting out of their own physical passions, and so that makes their act of a lesser value spiritually. I mean, that's where Augustine went with all this. Augustine associated all physical desire and pleasure with lust. In the Latin, the word was concupiscence. You'll find that in your King James Bible if you look for it. But it's the Latin word for lust. So for him, physical desire, physical pleasure constituted lust. Now, Augustine's views on this prevailed in the Roman Catholic Church forever. I mean, the church has become more lenient in more recent days, but not that far. And to see basically the low view of desire and pleasure as it developed in early Christianity, I've got a quote here from Saint Anselm. Now, Anselm was of right around the 11th century. And so he's like 6 centuries removed from Augustine. But this was his attitude. There is one evil, and an evil above all other evil, that I am aware is always with me, that grievously and piteously lacerates and afflicts my soul. It was with me from the cradle. It grew with me in childhood, in adolescence, in my youth. It always struck me. And it does not desert me even now that my limbs are failing because of my old age. This evil is sexual desire. So, I mean, this was the general attitude of the Christian church for 1,500 years about marriage and sexuality. Totally different from the attitude of the Jews who wrote the Song of Songs. As I said last week, with these attitudes, I can't imagine any Christian having ever written the Song of Songs. And nobody's ever suggested that it was written by a Christian. Obviously, it was written before Christ. But what it did do is it gave an enormous pressure upon Christians to do something with this book. it's in their canon. It's in our canon. If I have this view of marriage and sexuality, what am I supposed to do with a book that starts out, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth? I mean, and it goes on. We'll see here in a second. Okay, so last week I shared with you all the times when the Jewish rabbis were saying that you have to make love. Well, this was the Christians' answer to this. These are the times when you're not allowed to make love. You're not allowed to make love on Sunday. You're not allowed to make love on many of the feast days, and if you look at a Catholic calendar, there are a lot of feast days out there. You're not allowed to make love for the 2 days before communion. Now, fortunately, when that rule was placed, they were not doing communion every Sunday like they do now. Okay? It was very sparingly in the early church. You can't make love the 20 days before Christmas. You cannot make love the 40 days before Easter. You cannot make love during the 20 days before Pentecost. You cannot make love to your wife if she's already pregnant because, there's no reason to, because procreation is the only valid reason to make love. They did later on develop the view that marital unity is an appropriate reason to make love. They never took the view that desire and pleasure is an appropriate reason to make love to your spouse. That's not an appropriate reason. Some scholars took all this, took a calendar, and they added it all up and basically said, if you add it all up, the amount of time of the year that you're not allowed to make love accounts for about 5 months. 5 months out of the year, you're not allowed to make love to your spouse. You're on.
Sadly enough, because of the influence of the Roman Church, one of our pastors taught this in his church to his people,
Yeah.
to his elders,
Yeah.
about what would be proper
Yeah.
etiquette and intimacy. Anyway, that's
Yeah. And last week I pointed out that for the Jews, lovemaking can take pretty much any form you want that you mutually agree upon. For the early Christians, basically any form that could not produce a child was forbidden. I'll let you use your imaginations on that. Okay, now, as you can imagine, when you've got your church leaders saying this, there's going to be a disconnect between what the church leaders say and what the people in the pews are actually doing. We're hormonal creatures with hormones that God has given us. And those hormones are raging, and those hormones don't care what the preacher is saying up front. And so there becomes a huge disconnect that we see even today between what Christian leaders say and what people do. I was looking at some surveys, and I just want to highlight just one point. The Roman Catholic Church has forever forbidden the use of artificial contraception. And up until 1930, all Christian denominations forbade the use of artificial contraception. Catholics still do. But a study shows that 98% of sexually experienced Catholic women have used artificial contraception. The church says don't do it. 98% of Catholics are doing it. There's a disconnect there between what leaders say and what people are doing. And that disconnect could be a whole study in and of itself. But it's during this period of time, from Jerome and Augustine all the way through to the Protestant Reformation, that the Song of Songs is being studied and interpreted by Christian leaders. And they're always taking it as obviously an allegory of Christ and his love for the church, which I believe it is. But they refuse to see in it anything other than that. So let's go to the Protestant Reformation. And Martin Luther, he changes things up and and relaxes things a bit. Obviously, Martin, after being excommunicated, he gets married to a nun. So obviously he no longer believes in celibacy. And he wrote a letter to a fellow Protestant Reformed monk extolling the virtues of making love to your wife. But even he could not just throw off 1,500 years of church history. So he put it this way. He says, "Indeed, it is indeed true that sexual intimacy in marriage should be moderate, to extinguish the burning of the flesh." He saw sexual intimacy in marriage for the purpose of pleasure and getting a necessary biological release as legitimate. Just as we should observe moderation in eating and drinking, so pious couples should refrain from indulging their flesh too much. So that was sort of the attitude that he took. That, yeah, it's okay, it's good, it's a gift from God, but don't take it too far. Don't enjoy it too much. He would not have agreed with Rabbi Eleazar, who said that unemployed people should be making love to their wives every day since they're home every day. So he would not agree with that. Okay. Yeah, is your hand up, Ron? Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I just saw it out of the corner of my eye, and as I've got a lot of notes here, and I'm trying to figure out what I really want to say. Okay. Interestingly enough, of all the Protestant denominations, one of the most open to sexual intimacy in marriage was the Puritans. And I thought that was interesting. The Puritans took the matrimonial duty of sex so seriously that failure to extend due benevolence by either partner could be grounds for church discipline. There's at least one case on record in which a husband was excommunicated for neglecting his wife by not having intimacy with her over a long period of time. So the Puritans were a little bit more welcoming of sexual intimacy in marriage. So I mentioned Jerome wrote a commentary on the Song of Songs, and there were a couple of monks at the time of Jerome and Augustine who took a totally different view, Jovinian and Julian of Eclanum. And Jovinian and Julian took the view that marriage and celibacy were of equal value, that a celibate person wasn't more spiritually superior to a married person. Jovinian got excommunicated for his views. Julian was sent off into exile. He had other issues going on, but these guys, there were some people who pushed back against Augustine and Jerome. Augustine won every battle. I mean, every theological battle he won. So here we get what Jerome has to say, and he's got a couple of quotes from the song. The bold lettering is a quote from the song, and then what's not bold is his explanation. "Drink deeply, my love." This comes from Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 1. "Drink deeply, my love. The bride bids us to drink of the wine of the new covenant. This is the wine which makes youths and maidens thirst for virginity. Upon drinking it, they are intoxicated with the spirit of chastity. Invite my lover to come in. Bid him to enjoy my fruits." By fruits, and that is from the same verse. By fruits is signified all the virtues of virginity. I put this up here just to show how Jerome's attitude towards marriage and sexuality is now influencing how he reads the Song of Songs. And he reads it in such a way that it is not a book about marital intimacy at all. It is a book about people deliberately rejecting marital intimacy. And so that's the way he reads it. And this is an indication of basically how easily it is to read the Song of Songs, pretty much read whatever you want into it. And that's the challenge that we're going to have in a few weeks when we come back. Okay, any thoughts before I close? I'm actually going to stop a little bit early today. Yeah, Carol. Yeah, I mean, how many Shakers are there anymore today? I mean, there was a denomination in the 1800s called the Shakers, and they took that view that sexual relations, even within marriage, is wrong and sinful. Well,
They don't exist.
there ain't no more Shakers. They made great furniture, but they're not around anymore. Yeah, Teresa.
So this isn't just limited to early church fathers. It has spread worldwide. Oh, yeah. And especially like with Catholicism, and we're in a French-speaking country. The first church there was Catholic. And so these are all the undermining attitudes of people, whether they're animist or not. So we dealt heavily with this. And 40 years ago, when we were arriving as new missionaries, all this legalism. And women's meeting once a week was very heavily attended by women who weren't working outside the family, which was increasing more and more. But these would be some of the topics come up. Can I have sex this week? Is communion.
Yep.
And all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, oh, yes, about hearing this almost out of the pulpit. And, but the young women who were real, these were believing godly women. Of course, they weren't in those meetings because they were working women, working for oil companies. And so their thinking is really revolutionizing and shaking the church up. And they would, of course, come to us missionaries, and we would talk about all these issues. And those young women, and they were all married, walked a tightrope in the church, and just on the verge of being excommunicated.
Yeah.
We dealt with these issues. I can't say that if they had these old pastors, it just was prevalent until those men died off. Now we got this new generation coming through Bible school that were trained more and more with younger missionaries. And some of these ideas sometimes were not so prevalent. They weren't like discussed in church.
Yeah. For those online, Teresa's just sharing that this isn't just an early church father phenomenon. In her experiences as a missionary in France, she was dealing with these attitudes here in the 20th century. Yeah, Allison.
I'm trying to become more intentional about noticing my emotions, and I keep reading some of this and I keep smiling, and so I'm reflecting internally with myself, and I think I agree with you. I'm angry, and it's one of those things. Earlier you're talking about them viewing Song of Songs as an allegory for Christ's love for the church, and I'm like, why would we use a sinful allegory to describe Jesus' love for the church? And this is such a horrible sin.
Yeah. For those online, Allison is sharing that if the early church fathers are going to use the song as an allegory, why use an allegory containing sinful behavior as an allegory of the pure love of Jesus for the church? That's a great question. I mean, the problem with the early church fathers, and I will be sympathetic to this extent, the song was dropped on them. The early church fathers accepted the Hebrew Old Testament as it was. And I don't know that there was any real discussion about accepting only parts of it. They just accepted it as it was. And now you've got this book that talks about fruit and gardens and vineyards and all this stuff. And there's erotic meanings to all of those words. And you got to do something with it. And you certainly don't want to do anything that's going to encourage the people in your church to be making love, heaven forbid. And so And so you have to come up with something. So this is what they came up with. But yeah, I'm angry. As a Christian, I'm angry. As a Christian, I'm embarrassed. As Teresa was sharing about what they were dealing with in France, it made me think, what's happening between the church leaders and their congregants is you're backing your congregants into a corner. And if this is the way we're going to teach about marital intimacy, you're basically giving people no option other than just to leave the church. I mean, this disconnect is so great that if I'm married and I'm making love to my wife, and the pastor's up there saying I can't do it because it's Sunday or whatever, eventually I'm going to say, Pastor, I don't care. I don't care what you say. And I'm sure that there are millions of people sitting in pews who are saying that. And eventually they're going to stop sitting in the pews. And I think that's what's going on. Yeah, Allison.
Or, I mean, like Catholics say, you just pay for your sins.
Yeah. As Allison says, as the Catholics say, you just pay for your sins. You go to confession and do a penance, and so this is the world of Catholicism. You sin throughout the week. You don't care that you sin throughout the week, and then you go to church on Sunday. You confess and give alms, and now it's all taken care of, and you get this cycle going back and forth. Yeah, Ruth, and then don't come back.
Appreciate you putting these two contrasts together, because when you think of it, you're talking about it just being dropped in the laps, and you think of how people that wrote the Bibles, many of them were still Jews that came, under Christ, and so they grew up with all of this, they understood it. But my question is, do we have anybody that are the first people speaking in the beginning centuries to the Christian church that actually grew up with Hebrew other than the people that wrote the books of the Bible?
Yeah,
Is there anybody that actually grew up in that?
I'm sure there probably were, but I don't know.
And that's the ones that we know that gave so much to us, right?
Yeah.
And so what a disconnect not to understand it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, and Ruth was asking the question, are there other Hebrews other than the Christian Hebrews around the time of Christ? I mean, the Hebrews that aren't the Christians, they're following the rabbis. And so they're doing the rabbinical writings. The Hebrews that are Christians, they're following the early church fathers, the apostolic fathers. Most of the apostles are of Jewish background. So as Ruth points out, they understand all of this from a Jewish mindset. Paul's writing 1 Corinthians 7 from a Jewish mindset.
Yes.
We're reading it from a Gentile mindset. As a Gentile, we're reading it with a mind that's been influenced by Plato. Augustine was heavily influenced by Plato. Jerome was influenced by Plato. I didn't even mention my hero, Origen. He was way out there too. And so he's no longer my hero. I mean, I really loved Origen for a long time, but the more I learn about him, he's no longer my hero. But at any rate, this is hard for me to wrestle with. And these thoughts and attitudes, we can say, well, we don't think like that anymore. There is an undercurrent of Augustinianism within us today. And even as I read Christian author after Christian author trying to deal with these issues, even they are having a hard time expressing a positive mindset about all of this. I mean, the one thing, I'm going to save that for when we come back, because I'm over time now. But yeah, this is hard. This is hard for me. It's hard for me to study this. It's hard for me to wrap my arms around this. So with that, I'm thankful to Zach, who will take the next 3 weeks. He'll give me some time to get my thoughts together and see how in the world I want to approach the actual song when we come back, because we're going to look into it and see how we do that. All right, so let me close this in prayer. Father, we do thank you. We thank you for your goodness to us. Father, I stand up here and I don't know what to do with the church history as it relates to this topic. And I think we need to be aware that we are still affected by it emotionally, mentally, in our thoughts. And I just pray that you will give us wisdom.
Yes.
James says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask. And so we're asking for it, that you would give us wisdom. I pray for those in the fellowship who still have children at home and having to guide them in these tricky issues as they're growing up, dealing with their own lives and hormones. I pray for them that you would give them wisdom. Father, I pray, Father, for our church service. I pray that you would be with the worship team as they lead us in worship. And I pray that you would be with Pastor as he brings your message. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.